Hello, and welcome back to the Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at the Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. Today's guest is Stephen Jenkinson, author, culture worker, and founder of the Orphan Wisdom School. He holds master's degrees from Harvard Divinity School and the University of Toronto. Stephen is perhaps best known for his book Die Wise and the documentary Grief Walker, which followed his work with dying people and their families. But his work has never been only about death. It is also about culture, ancestry, ritual, elderhood, grief, obligation, and what happens to a people when they no longer inherit reliable ways of living, dying, belonging, or remembering. I began this conversation by trying to enter through Stephen's earlier critique of death in modern culture, but he made it clear very early that this was not exactly where his work lives anymore. So the conversation shifted. Instead of treating death as an individual problem, we began talking about culture itself. What does a culture owe? Who does it owe it to? What happens when a country is made, in large part, by people cut off from old traditions, old obligations, old rituals, and old ways of accounting for their lives? From there, we discuss Canada as a kind of orphan culture shaped by immigration, displacement, memory loss, and reinvention. Stephen reflects on the difficulty of building wisdom from that condition and why ritual, story, elders, artists, and creators may matter more to the future of a culture than politics alone. We also talk about freedom and the modern temptation to define freedom as freedom from constraints. Stephen pushes against that idea, describing it as a more adolescent version of freedom, one that leaves people isolated from the very obligations that might have once formed them. Later in the conversation, we turn to marriage, matrimony, family, and the traditions many modern people experience as oppressive, especially when those traditions are inherited without love or explanation. Stephen does not romanticize the past, but he does ask whether we have understood what is lost when we abandon inherited forms without knowing how to replace them. Near the end, we discuss his new book, Trembling, Still, written in the wake of a serious neurodegenerative diagnosis. Unlike his earlier books, Stephen describes this one less as a cultural critique and more as something closer to a war story, a reckoning with illness, mind, selfhood, and the possibility that the person you have known yourself to be may not remain available to you. This is a conversation about death, culture, ritual, ancestry, obligation, illness, and what it means to do culture work in a country still trying to understand what is inherited and what it has lost. Here's my conversation with Stephen Jenkinson. Stephen Jenkinson, welcome to the Canadians. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I encountered your work maybe going back like 10 years ago. I think you came into my city and a friend of mine mentioned that I might be interested in checking this out. There's this guy who's, talking about death and how, we've kind of hidden it away and we need to reevaluate how we're approaching death in our culture. And I thought, oh, this sounds like an interesting lecture. I'll go check this out. And I went to the theater to see it. And there's a bit of a lecture, but there was also some poetry and some storytelling and some song and music. And by the end of the evening, I kind of felt like I'd more participated in something than just sat and watched something. And I went out and bought Die Wise afterwards, and I gave it to a friend of mine who was really struggling through some grief at the time. And
Yeah.
it's led to years of conversations. And I'm not going to try to put your work in a nutshell or try to summarize it up in any way because I think it's just it resists that. I think when I engage with your work, it feels almost more like an invitation into something deeper and maybe even a little unknown. And so I thought maybe we could just find some entry point into this conversation. And it seems like maybe what put you on the map got you the name the Grief Walker, your years of working in the palliative care industry, and maybe I was wondering if you could just start us off by maybe articulating the critique that you formed over those years about death and in our culture.
Mhm. Well, I can try. It's been a while, this stuff, what you're asking me about is not really current for me at this point. This is going back 25 years or so, but but fair enough. Let me see what I can do.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, the first thought is that at the time, I wasn't aware that there was such a thing as palliative care. I mean, I knew the term. What I didn't know was that there was a specialization, a kind of psychic and ghetto or silo called end of life care. That it had its acolytes, it had its high priests, it had its gospels, its 10 commandments, and all the rest. I was really staggered to find this out. One. Two, I was doubly surprised to find out that the whole thing seems to have been cobbled together or conjured or invented with virtually no recourse to the realities of dying, particularly for the dying people themselves. In other words, it was a lot of psychology, a lot of psychology. And psychology is not necessarily death literate, or death friendly or death inclined. It's health inclined, typically. So whenever you have a kind of competence addicted, health addicted kind of arrangement with a heavy dose of youth fixation on the side, what do you end up with people who are, quote, failing to thrive? What kind of diagnostic repertoire do you end up with? What kind of shaming motif comes to play when people are not getting better? Right? So that's what I walked into the middle of. Now, nobody described it that way, needless to say. It was, needless to say, it wasn't, nobody was particularly troubled by the way things were going. So I was a kind of disaffected party of one. So, not being completely stupid on the matter, what I did was I sat in the weeds for a while and just watched how this thing actually works to see if I got it right, if my first impressions really, endured in any way. And man, I have to tell you that I discovered, boy, did I ever get it right.
Right.
Yeah, it was desperately correct. So then the next thing I had to do was figure out, just from a moral point of view, what position I was going to take, if any. Should I even remain there? Is it possible to undergo to perform or deliver a kind of service, a fundamental life-affirming service to dying people, whereby the realities of their dying could actually appear in the service instead of disappearing as a consequence of the people around them trying to cheerlead them into kind of positive orientations and behaviors. That took a lot of figuring, how I could actually craft a language where the realities of dying would appear, which I thought was the least obligation I had. And then finally, for the moment at least, the other thing that occurred to me is, man, I had a serious question to ask myself about to whom did I owe what? The employer, the hospital, the professional designation, the other professions I was working with, my own sort of life experience, my own professional affiliation, and the things I was seeing. Where the best part of me was supposed to go in which direction on whose behalf and that sort of thing. And in trying to figure that out, I began to realize that the dying people, sadly, were as complicit in the grim affair that I've just described to you as the paid professionals who were certainly paid to know better were in, right? So it was really a terrible cabal. I'm making it sound like a very well orchestrated. Oh man, I'm blanking on the word here. When you have a conspiracy, I'm making it sound like a conspiracy. I don't mean to suggest that it was. What was going on here was that the whole operation was happening. This is not the fault of the fact that it was happening in the context of a hospital. Not at all. The fundamental problem was everything I'm describing to you was happening in the context of a death-phobic culture. And
Okay.
that was the great realization I had, that if I was going to do anything about this, I had to constantly reestablish myself as a culture worker, not a psychological practitioner, not a spiritual care provider, a culture worker. And that meant I had to take aim at the kind of death intolerance and death illiteracy that's part and parcel of the death phobic culture. And I had to work at the level of culture, one dying person at a time, one dying person and their family at a time. That's kind of how it started.
And you mentioned, and I'll be upfront here. I'm not like overly familiar with your work in the sense I haven't gone to your workshops. I haven't, so I have a certain amount of ignorance brought into this conversation. But I can see that you mentioned earlier that it's been a while since you've talked about death in this manner, and your work has moved on. And so, is that where your work has moved on to? You mentioned earlier this sparked up feelings of what do I owe? Who do I owe it to? And now you're talking about culture. And I often feel when I'm looking at your work that it can be a mistake to individualize it too much. You're not just talking about, just improving the individual's experience of death necessarily. It sounds like you are talking about culture itself, having to be willing to know when it's right, has to die off and allow something else to grow out of it. Is that where your work has gone more than just specifically the individual dealing with death?
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think that's pretty accurate.
Oh, yeah.
Over the period of this quarter century that we're referring to now, yes, I went from a kind of clinical orientation that was very psychodynamic and very wedded to the immediate recognizable benefit of the individual, to a broader understanding of where the principal dilemmas that the individuals are contending with that brought them to my attention, where these things are to be located and to be, I thought, more properly or broadly addressed. As soon as I came to that understanding, then it opened up that it wasn't just the fact that it was a death phobic culture, but there was a lot of other elements to the culture. By the culture now, I should say I'm referring to the dominant culture of Anglo North America.
Hmm.
I'm not speaking globally here.
Yeah.
And in that context, the the dominant culture that I was born to has, let's just say, a few problems. and and this one that I initially talked to you about is just one. And it's not the worst. It's not the principal one. It's not the one from which all the others fall. I mean, a big part of it is the homelessness of the culture,
Right.
the kind of spontaneous immigrant-driven history of the sort of Anglo population of the joint. That has huge ramifications for what we've just been talking about and other things besides. And so this gave way to, from me practicing in the context of a hospital with people who are dying, to within 4 or 5 years, establishing something I called the Orphan Wisdom School, which was here on my farm in the Ottawa Valley and lasted for about 12 years, and drew people literally from all over the world, all walks of life. It wasn't a sort of end of life school by any stretch of the imagination. It was a school that was basically devoted to the question of what is the birth pangs and the consequences of this drastic European fantasy called America. Not the United States. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the notion of America, the idea of being a kind of free, wide open kind of possibility place. All you got to do is quote, work hard, all of that stuff. To the fact that it was there was no question of law transgressed as a result of the way things were done, and finally that this notion that's sort of biblically driven, I suppose, that you do if you're a good person and you mean well, you get to start over.
Right.
Never mind that it's in somebody else's backyard, but you get to start over, right? So as soon as things connected that way, then I wasn't just working in the context of dying. I was working in the context of, well, for example, the next book I wrote after Die Wise, which is about these matters, was a book about elderhood, quite an elaborate, quite long thing about elderhood and its MIA status in Anglo-North America. And the one after that concerned itself with the pandemic. And the one after that concerned itself with, the order escapes me now. More recently, I did one about matrimony.
Yeah.
So, but you can hear in each one of these, well, one was about money and the soul. Okay, so there's 8, or that's why I can't remember them all at the moment. But each one of these books is informed by an understanding that the context is properly cultural, not properly individual. There's lots of room for individual consideration, but I'm really talking about, we don't come to our inadequacies either voluntarily or easily. We come to them by default, it seems to me. And the default is the cultural poverty. That's the default reality that we're drawing on constantly to inform us about how we should, quote, live better lives. So all the problem-solving industries, self-help and all the rest, all of these things are predicated on the vision of an improved life being informed by a culture that's principally in desperate disarray. So, of course, all the answers that a broken culture gives you for how to fix it all have the breakage in them, don't they?
Yeah.
Of course they would, and they do. So yes, I took that understanding and applied it to various sort of issues of the day, it seemed to me.
Right. And I guess that's where the orphan you're speaking of, when the orphan wisdom, that's that idea that we kind of act out all the husks of these traditions, whether it's a funeral or a wedding, but we've lost the act. And it's interesting that you said it's because of the immigrant kind of nature of how the West kind of put itself together, or at least, and that you see it kind of severing us from the actual meaning behind the traditions, and now we're just kind of acting them out, and that's the orphan aspect.
That's a part of it, but I'll get to the orphan in a second. But the dilemma, as I understand it, is the rupture in continuity. The linguists say that if you have an interruption in the inheritance of the language from one generation to the next, all it takes is a disturbance in 2 generations sequentially to fundamentally endanger the presence of the language in the present order, right? It doesn't take much for a language to disappear.
Right.
So if you don't think in terms of language narrowly, but you think about cultural continuity more broadly, but you come to the same understanding that after 2 generations of rupture or interruption or lack of bequeathing, that's the word I guess I need. When that is in effect, you don't have people who are operating as where the self-understanding is that they belong where they are,
Right.
and they can proceed accordingly. Not that they own the joint, they belong there.
Mm-hmm.
Their sense of belonging is a consequence of the nature of the place, not the other way around.
Right.
So all of those things are unavailable to a culture that doesn't have a kind of repeating availability of what's come before. So the orphan wisdom reference, I was trying to find a sort of broad term that would, in a phrase, describe the stance I was taking about what the kind of remedial work that must be done. So the first one is to acknowledge what I think is obvious. That is that anybody who looks like me on the North American continent is by definition an orphan. Now, when you say that, the first image that leaps to a lot of people's minds is no parents. But that's not ever true. The fact that you were born, at least until recently, suggests that there are parents indeed. The word orphan means you can't get to your parents from here. You have no direct access to them. right? You don't have a living memory of the sound of their voices, for example, things of that order, right? Which is in its way very desperate making and very, very hard life to live. There's no question about it. But without an acknowledgement of the orphanhood of the dominant culture of North America, you get what you get.
Right, yeah.
You get what we have. Having said that, if you stop there, with a just kind of generic indictment, finger wagging and all the rest, and what do you end up with? You end up with more self-annihilation, more self-hatred, more guilt being, masquerading as conscience and all that sort of gear. So the recommendation I'm making with the phrase is to suggest that orphans are absolutely capable of culturally endorsed, enduring, and very useful wisdom. But they have to do a different kind of work to achieve it. They can't simply inherit it from those who came before them. So the work of an orphan culture to reinstate its wisdom is different from a culture that's indigenously belonging to the place it finds itself.
Right.
That's basically the understanding.
Right. Because they have a sense of belonging. All right. And so, yeah, I guess that's getting into the importance of ritual, possibly. Is that?
Well, that would be in there.
Yeah.
Yes, ritual and ceremony are there to, among other things, to recalibrate people's lived relationship with the place and what precedes the present in that place.
You're almost describing technically how meaning has been stripped from the modern West.
Well, see, if you put it that way, it sounds like there's a bad guy somewhere.
Yeah, without the intention. Yeah.
The bad guys did the stripping, right?
Yeah.
And the poor, vulnerable victims on the other side had no choice in the matter, didn't know what was going on, just woke up one day and everything was gone. I mean, that's not true any more than it was true that the doctors and the nurses forced bad dying upon dying people. As I said to you a few minutes ago, the dying people were complicit in the arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, by the same token, I'm suggesting to you here that the culturally orphaned among us, and I would include myself in that understanding, are complicit in our impoverishment. Over and over and over and over again, I've done so many interviews, I can't begin to describe how many it is. And over again, do you know what the principal request I get in every interview? Most of the questions are heading in which direction? How do we fix it? That's all that people want to hear about.
Yeah.
How do we fix it? And, this is a question that has carnage and failure in it, because you don't fix it by asking how you fix it.
Right.
You don't fix it by going to solutions first. You fix it. It's not a good phrase, but if I have to use it, you fix it by, first of all, inquiring, what is this it you're proposing to fix? If you can't be lucid there, you'll never be lucid about what the solutions are. Yeah. So when I respond more or less in kind and people get over their frustration, if they do, one of the things I end up saying is, you begin with your poverty, or you're probably not beginning.
Yeah. Is there a way of framing it? Is like that, and there's almost let's say just say the way you are looking at death compared to, let's say, how you described it in the beginning, the death industry, that some places, is it starting with a certainty, and then there is someone is dying in my family. This is what you do in that situation. You do 1, 2, and 3, as opposed to, I find as I'm getting older in life that I'm discovering more and more it's a process of discovery. I discover how sad I am. I discover that's almost what it sounds like you're describing is not approaching things with certainty, but actually approaching things from a place of wonder and mystery, and willing to even discover stuff about yourself as opposed to just reacting with certainty.
Right. And awe. I mean, that belongs in it. It's the oldest religion, I figure. Awe.
So I've been wrestling with this quotation from an essay, when I was engaging with your work, I really felt there's some overlap. Maybe I'll try it on you and you tell me if it resonates with you at all. And it's from an essay called "The Cross in the Machine" by a guy named Paul Kingsnorth.
Sure, I know him.
Okay, I'm okay. And, I'm paraphrasing here because I'm just going off. Because I've been really wrestling with this for years now. Because it says something like, I was raised like most modern people with the idea that freedom means freedom from constraints.
Right,
But now I see that as no freedom at all.
right.
This is about his journey to Orthodox Christianity. He's like, Orthodoxy taught me that that's no freedom at all, that that's just being a slave to your passions. Does that resonate with your work at all?
I don't know about the very last part, about
Or,
the
yeah,
slave to the passions part, but certainly
the
the first
freedom.
part.
Okay.
Absolutely recognizable that freedom, this is a child's or an adolescent's understanding of what I said a few minutes ago, being able to start again is all about.
Hmm.
You know, this notion that it's a free country. I mean, it's an unbelievable declaration, but people make it all the time to defend what? To defend their the belief they have that they have the inherent right to be self-directing
Hmm.
with no consequence attached to that and no responsibility for any consequences that ensue.
Hmm.
So this is a very good example of how we went from once upon a time and some considerable time ago now, there was a basic understanding of what constituted collective life, the kind of mucilage that bound people together, not forced them together, but literally bound them together with
Hmm.
a sense of mutual belonging, mutual recognition, mutual obligation, another shamed word, obligation. But all of these things, they are what constitutes culture in action. Okay. When you replace that ultimately with terrible ghost towns like the nuclear family or the single parent family or the sovereign rights of the individual or the notion of personal truth, when that's what you end up with, I mean, you can't be overly surprised that there's loneliness most days.
Hmm.
And that's what that quote freedom is. Leonard Cohen had a good line about it too. It was a song called Closing Time. He says, he said something like, it looks like freedom, but it feels like death. It's
Yeah.
something in between, I guess. It's
Yeah.
closing
That's right.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Where I've been wrestling with it myself, I think, is that I've been really thinking this way a bit more, just finding that it is more holding myself to probably what I'd call like healthy constraints that I feel that as I get older, it kind of reveals like a more a pathway for me to walk through life as opposed to me just being able to decide whatever I want to do with no constraints, freedom. But my parents were Japanese. They emigrated to Canada in the 30s, and so I have stories. I think most of my life, I resonated with that first part of that expression, that freedom means having no constraints. And I look back, and the wrestling part is like I look at my Japanese family, and like, my grandpa emigrated here, and he met a woman, and he wrote to my grandma, who he had an arranged marriage with, to not come to Canada. He had met someone, he was happy, and her family said, that's going to cause so much shame in the community that my grandma moved here, kicked that woman out of the house,
Wow.
and went on to have like 7 kids together, but they hated each other their entire lives. This was done out of that obligation. And so I had a friend who was like, born and raised in Canada, but his, Pakistani born parents expected that he would have an arranged marriage with a Pakistani woman, despite his whole life being raised in Canada. And he didn't
Yeah.
want that. And so I tend to take those traditions, and I traditionally have attached oppression to them,
Right.
And so how do we how do you have any advice on how I can think about that a little more openly or differently? Is that where are those places where those cultures, when it reaches that point where it's crushing the individual, that's where certain parts of those traditions have to be willing to die off, adapt and grow into something new? Is that what a healthy outcome would look like?
Okay. There's a few things at play here in the questions you're asking.
All right.
Okay. In no particular order, just as it occurs to me.
Yeah.
First one is, it's really incumbent upon, was it your grandparents that came to Canada?
Yeah.
Okay. It's incumbent upon them to understand that they set certain things into motion as a result of leaving the place they left, whatever their reasons were for leaving. Okay.
Mhm.
Whatever they were. But however, quote, well-intended it was and all the rest, it doesn't make the decision they made work for the subsequent generations.
Right.
Okay. So what you have is you, and you've well described it, is a sequence of circumstances where people end up with a kind of enduring loathing for each other, ostensibly, and then your generation decides that their loathing is a consequence of tradition. I would suggest to you that's not what it is at all. What's happening there instead, unfortunately, is a kind of an attempt to live a ghosted tradition, a kind of the rudiments of a tradition
Mm.
that the circumstance around them can't sustain
Right. Right.
because nobody's in it with them.
They're not embedded in that culture anymore.
No, you can't make a tradition with two people.
Right.
You really can't. And you certainly can't keep one alive with two people, because as soon as you have kids in this strange context, and these kids go to school and they realize very quickly that nobody lives like that.
Hmm.
So what did you think your children were going to grow up with? What kind of self-understanding, putting this whole sequence into motion? I'm not saying nobody should move around. I am saying, though, if you're a grown-up, then your manner of immigrating has to acknowledge the certain sequence of grim facts. And one of them is you'll be a hyphenated a hyphenated identity for some considerable number of generations thereafter. Right. And you'll be neither quite fish nor fowl. You won't belong to the tradition because you've decided the tradition is notorious and tyrannical and means nobody no good, and that's why they were unhappy. And I'm suggesting to you that's not why they were unhappy. It's because they were trying to do something that had no rootedness. It was all just free floating. It was this kind of ostensible notion of honor. But honor, I don't think honor is nearly as punishing a consideration as that sad story would suggest that it is.
Oh.
Right. So, I mean, in terms of what's to be done, I mean, it's the same thing I said earlier. You have to begin somewhere with an honest to God, three-dimensional assessment of, quote, what did you think it was going to be like? And is it the fault of Canada? Not the Japanese tradition. Is it the fault of Canada that these two people hated each other? I mean, is it anybody's fault?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it a kind of weather pattern that's a consequence of certain things you put into motion that you never really wondered about because you were just trying to get away, or because you're trying to get out from a feudal arrangement or an arranged marriage arrangement, but you can't, in human affairs, you can run, but you can't delete from the record the inconvenient parts of the story you wish weren't so.
Mm-hmm. So I can see how challenging that is, like even as you're describing the kind of immigrant makeup of our culture. Have you given thought then to the effect, like the internet culture is, what effect is that having?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't use the word internet and the word culture in the same phrase.
Right. Okay.
Okay, let's reserve the word culture for a kind of achievement,
Right.
kind of continuity over time, achieved, kind of highly regarded, highly practiced, lots of tradition, lots of trial and error to try to figure out what constitutes, quote, us, all that kind of stuff. And I know, we both know that Canada doesn't have a tried and true understanding of itself. It's too young,
Mm-hmm.
right? Number one. And number two, it's an accidental country. Nobody said, let's make a Canada that's built this way and it has this kind of characteristics in it. No, the simple truth of the matter is this country is a result of the fact that people north of the 49th parallel did not want to be Americans.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not really a foundation.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad the call was made that way because I wouldn't want to be one either. But and I consider myself lucky to have been born where I was. But man, a lot of work is needed, nonetheless. But it seems to me, for example, if we're radiated by the American example as we are every day, and you see Americans are full of themselves to the point of suffocation, with a kind of self-understanding and a kind of national mythology and a personal mythology to go along with it, and all that doodah that ignores most of the actual history that went on in that place for the last 250 years. And you say to yourself, is that what it's like, that or nothing? Like you just wave the flag or nothing? You sing this song that's meaningless and you put your hand somewhere on your chest and that's it. That gives you and then you say, love it or leave it, or you talk about making it great again, and that's it. That's all you've got. So the answer is no, that's not all you've got. But I mean, it's a terrible example, and it's an adolescent example that we're contending with just south of the border all the time. See? So, well, there's a long tunnel to go down here in terms of crafting a culture from a kind of ragged absence of a binding national mythology.
Mhm.
One of the things we had for the longest time is the notion of a mosaic that, in other words, that people didn't have an obligation to, quote, become Canadians because even the people who thought they were already Canadians didn't really know what that meant.
Yeah.
There was nothing to join. So then it's a matter of how you live your life day in and day out. And is there a degree of tolerance that actually works, for example? And I mean, it's a lot of stuff here I just don't want to get down into, about immigration policy. And I mean, I just don't know enough about it, and I'd be just shooting from the hip and all that sort of stuff. Let's just say for the moment, though, that we certainly have enormous amount of work cut out for us as Canadians to live up to something that was a possibility, but a very scant possibility close to the beginning. And that was when you got a chance to see what the Americans were doing with, quote, their chance, which is what the book Moby Dick's all about. It's all about how America never happened. And now it's gone. By the 1830s, gone. We saw that example and we had the opportunity to proceed otherwise. What have we done with that opportunity? So an honest assessment of these kind of things and that's part of the poverty. And yes, it's part of the question of the relationship with Indigenous peoples and, residential schools. And, there's lots of things to talk about, surely. But all of these constitute what? A kind of opportunity for you to find out what you really think this a working culture is made of. What's it built from? What does it require? And does it really require that most people either look the same or behave the same? Is it principally a racial identity? Is it principally a backing away from a really bad example? And that in that act of backing away, you sort of inadvertently draw close to people on either side of you, which is basically the history of Canada in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so who do you think, I think a lot of emphasis gets put on politics and politicians, but really, you're talking about working in the culture, and it feels like that's kind of the last people to react. Politicians kind of generally put their finger up in the air, and there has to get that moment. So who do you see changing the culture? Is this storytelling and elders? Is that who we need to help out in this process?
Well, certainly that wouldn't be a bad idea. But you could say, let's use the generic term artists of all kinds, in all kinds of fields and declarations and activity. You ask yourself, what's the fundamental artist's job? Is it to decorate rich people's apartments? Come on now.
Mhm.
So could it be something much more compelling, useful, and important than that? The answer is yeah. The function of the artist, it seems to me, is to give the culture an opportunity to see itself in action, doing its business in whatever quality, with whatever mayhem ensues from that. But that's the principal job, is that the artist, by virtue of working the art and whatever skillfulness is given to them at birth or develops in them, they have an opportunity not just to reflect the culture back to the people, but to actually refract the culture. Meaning, you know how not quartz, but prism, how prism works with light, right? It refracts it to its constituent parts or colors, all of which tend to be invisible in, quote, white light. But they're there, and we know they're there scientifically. But this is a metaphor for culture. I'm using it to suggest that an artist's principal job is to let the light of culture pass through the art making and come out the other side sort of bifurcated and articulated. So the culture is not just a mystery to itself, nor does it seem so inevitably occurring. So it raises questions about whether or not, because we've done this for 100 years, does this constitute a decent and good reason for continuing to do it that way? So that's, to my mind, the artist's work is to be faithful to the culture by asking the culture to ever and ever again learn itself. And that's why you have to be so good at being an artist, so morally connected and engaged, so ethically informed, so historically alert. You know, it has nothing to do with self-expression. The best art has nothing to do with self-expression, in my view. It has everything to do with what we're talking about now.
Honesty.
Okay, yeah, fidelity, yeah,
Mm.
sure.
Yeah, okay. And what role, ritual? Why does that play such an important role?
Well, maybe the question is, why should it? Because I'm not persuaded that it does actually play an important role the way things are,
Yeah.
right? Okay. But why should it? Well, it's the reason for that, the answer to your question is actually buried in the etymology of the word. So the RIT root of ritual is the same root as rhythm and rite, RITE, of course, obviously, and arithmetic or arithmetic. The root is the same in all of them. And basically what it means is, in the act of ritualizing, what you're doing is kind of counting, but not literally as I'm doing it now, one with a kind of metronome, like you do in sort of music, what they call a click track, that the band plays to, where that's not what it is. It's a kind of accounting. Put an A in front of it. So now you're just not going 1, 2, 3, 4. Accounting is a different kind of willingness to take the measure of things. In particular, those things, when the word is ritual instead of arithmetic, what you're talking about is, well, look, there are certain unseen presences or forces, if you will. You could call them gods or deities. You could call them spirits of place. None of these things would be out of order. And they have their consequence, you see, in the time that they live among us. We're not that alert to their presence, never mind their consequence. But ritualizing is a way of tracking the presence of this otherworldly engagement of this time and this place with other times and places. And in so doing, you get some sense of, let's call it the hidden or the wondrous, or those terms you're using off the top, wonder and awe and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
It's all engaged by this kind of ritualizing or tracking of how things are happening as they seem to happen,
Right.
and rather than just throwing up your hands. So ritualizing is a way of you could say, giving the unseen presences their due and learning a little bit the vernacular language that they have.
And so if we've become divorced from a lot of our rituals, does this require organically creating new ones?
Well, first of all, the assumption, the first half of the question, divorced from our rituals. I would say, I'd push you a little bit and say, and which ones are those that you're thinking of? And you might scramble a little bit to try to answer the question because as a notion, it seems to work. But as soon as you're asked for examples of the very rituals that you're talking about, you'd find that it wouldn't be so easy because it's not real for the likes of myself in this culture, in this corner of the world at this time. There's no there to get back to. This is a really important realization that we got to stop using the language of restore, reclaim, redeem, revive, return. All of those imply that, oh, there's the good old days. And those good old days are really something, man. And all we got to do is find a way to replicate that kind of stuff. And we're there again, and all shall be well. It was never that way for the likes of who looks like me on this continent. Never mind for the people that who looks like me found when they got to this continent. So, it's enough already with the Genesis story over and over and over and over again. It used to be perfect. We fucked it up, and now here we are. No. So the rituals that you're asking me about, instead of assuming them, the important initial work would be articulating them. Rituals for what? Let's take one out of the air, but an easy one to refer to. Rituals in which children cease to be children. So-called rites of passage at puberty.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what ritual would you like to revive about that? And the answer is, there isn't one. There isn't one. There's other people's rituals, things that you've read about in anthropology and so forth, yes. But there's nothing to revive in terms of your family line. Is there really?
Yeah.
Or are we talking about those two people who grew to hate each other so fiercely? Is there a ritual somewhere in there? Is that what Saving Face was all about? And the answer is probably not, no. But they employed matrimony to try to enact and engage to restore, to preserve in some way the Japaneseness that they had in mind for themselves, maybe. Maybe that's the way to say it. But none of these things are kind of rituals per se. So then if we're talking about the end of childhood, then you realize a lot of cultures that practice those kind of rituals understand that childhood does not go willingly. It doesn't disappear by itself. You get older, it doesn't mean your childhood is gone. God knows there's 50-year-old adolescents all over the place, right?
Yeah.
So if this thing is not in some fundamental way ritually executed, it finds a way of hanging on for desperate dear life, well into one's life, right? Okay, so in order to do anything about that, one of the things you have to do is ask yourself whether or not, do you continue to believe that people's parents bear the principal responsibility of making them into world citizens? That it's a parenting job first and foremost? Because that's what we've got. That's what's been going on your entire lifetime and mine. And so you can tell by the way I'm saying it that I'm suggesting this is one of our poverties.
Right.
Because without a working culture, families are on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And then what do? They build little walls around themselves called, this is how we do things. This is what we believe. This is how we are. These are my kids. It's none of your business. You have nothing to say. That's as good as it gets, that you have nothing to say as a teacher of the kids or as a neighbor. You have nothing to say. You just stay out of it and live and let live and, that sort of thing. But that's not culture. That's just suburbs.
And my mind went to the wedding ceremony as a
Yeah.
ritual, and I've heard
Mhm.
you talk about a way you've conducted weddings,
Mhm.
talking about the aisle and the crowds facing each other and just, it feels like, um not trying to recapture the past, but it sounds like organically trying to work in the present moment to, and maybe not to thinking about it as capturing the past, but just trying to help people thrive and the culture thrive and in the current place we're in. I wonder, I've seen you take apart the word like you did with ritual. I'm wondering, can I ask you to take apart the word matrimony like I've heard you do? Because it
Sure.
feels like that just strikes right to kind of the core of what you're also talking about
Sure.
here.
Sure. Sure. Well, first of all, if you use the word, it's a very antique word. I mean, virtually nobody uses it. But if you listen to people talk about it or watch their responses when I talk about it, one of the things that happens very quickly is they say they look for synonyms. They say, "Oh, matrimony's marriage," or "matrimony's a wedding," or "matrimony's a kind of love thing that agreed to have the government superintend it in some way," or and on and on. Okay, so if it's all those things, why do we have this word called matrimony? Well, why do we even need a separate word when apparently all those are perfectly fine? Here's why. It doesn't mean any of those things. It's not a synonym for any of them. It's not part of a graduated formula for achieving those things or getting there or having that. No, just look at the word. Start with the latter part of the word first, the moni part. There's a lot of words that end in moni, aren't there? Or monial, aren't there? All kinds of them. Actually, when you start really thinking about it, it's amazing. Uh, so the suffix means something in the order of the repertoire of, or the signs and the signals, or the footprints, or the signature, the kind of emotional, psychic, moral repertoire. It means all of this kind of toolkit kind of thing. It means all of that stuff. Okay. And then the root word in this case, matra. Does it mean woman? Does it mean wife? Surely it means wife. Doesn't mean wife. Does it mean female? Holy smokes. What's left? Mother. Mother. The repertoire of mothering. That's what the word matrimony means. The repertoire of mothering, the mothering work, if you will. If you don't think about it much, you immediately go to procreation of human infants. That's what you're talking about. You're talking about sex, biology, and reproduction. No, no, not when you're talking at the level of what we've been talking about here for the last 45 minutes. In this case, it means something like this. The culture needs its parents, not the children's parents. The culture itself needs the parenting repertoire.
Mhm.
And that's why we have the word matrimony and we have the word patrimony, a word that virtually never surfaces in contemporary discourse. And then let me connect it for a moment to wedding or marriage or that kind of stuff, because obviously it's connected, but it's not the same. So why does it appear in that you're invited to this thing, or formally or otherwise, where people say something about or they used to, and in some cases still do, I guess, join in the holy state of matrimony. That's a heavy thing to say,
Yeah.
the holy state of matrimony. And why is there no parallel invitation to join in the holy state of patrimony? You've never heard the term.
No.
I've never heard the term. What's going on? In this age of great inclusivity, we're very proud of all that shit, to the extent that it happens. And there's no inclusion of anything fathering repertoire, no similar elevation. What's going on there? Is it just because just women are better? Is that why? Where should We're just figuring it out. It's right there in the words. I don't think so. No, I think what it's saying is, listen, man, these are not a, replaceable digits. They're not co-equal. Okay, they're not. It's not the same thing with a changed anatomy. That's not the difference between them. The difference between them is a difference of, among other things, sequence. In a working culture, patrimony comes first. Means what? More important? If that's what it meant, that's what I would have said. No, it doesn't mean more important. Patrimony comes first means this. Patrimony's job is to make ready the world, to welcome, to engage, to make possible, and to deeply employ the human mothering capacity for culture. That's what patrimony is there for. It's to make ready the circumstances whereby matrimony can move into the house that patrimony builds.
Yeah.
Okay, such that life can be born again, anew, with a restored understanding or some kind of engaged understanding of how things need, what kind of articulation or what kind of change of direction or is needed, given the changes in the times, given the troubles and the weirdnesses of the times, and so forth.
Yeah.
There's tons to say about this, but that's a little overview.
Yeah. So that's kind of describing the death and rebirth and the reconstituting of culture in itself. It's as we're kind of getting near the hour marker, I wanted to leave a little bit of time to talk about, you've got a new book coming out. You've written Trembling Still.
Trembling
I
Still.
worked my way a bit through it, but it's not a book that lends itself to, reading it quickly before an interview. And so I found it a very, it's not an easy read. It's challenging, halted, very, yeah. But I guess I'll ask you, what moved you to start writing Trembling Still?
Well, Trembling Still is a different beast from all the other books. Earlier today in our talk, I described to you where the motivation came from to write the other ones.
Yeah.
The kind of cultural critique and so forth. This one, that's not, if it's there, it's very much in the background. This one was prompted very simply by the fact that totally unexpectedly, I had a medical appointment, and I came out of the medical appointment with an understanding that normal life as I understood it was officially dead that day. That's how drastic it was.
Mm-hmm.
The diagnosis was that drastic and that unexpected that my life as I understood it was over and unavailable and utterly gone as of the 2nd of January, whatever, 2024, I guess it was. And so I'm a bit of a habitual writer, probably. But in this case, I was trying to locate any capacity I might still have for sanity, literally. It was so drastic and so devastating. And it promised really real devastation in the longer term for me. Irreversible, nothing to be done, no operation, no drugs, no man. That's all gone. So that's how it started. And literally I was writing these. They weren't chapter long entries. These things were, half a page. And that's all I could manage. Half a page of trying to record seismically the devastation that had come or the predation that I was feeling on the receiving end of. And that's what it was, trying to locate my life and myself. And along the way, I came to begin to have a question about, sorry, I'll back up one step. If your diagnosis has to do with your liver, the chances are good that you're not going to have have a lot of strong feelings about your personality as a result of this diagnosis about your liver or about your mind or about yourself. The chances are if you have a lung problem, it's not going to go there either. But if you have a brain problem, the chances are very good that one of the questions that will arise very quickly and be exceedingly difficult to answer is, so who are you now? Now that your ability to resemble that person that you've been all along
Mm-hmm.
is completely up for grabs and probably never coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you now? And is the job to try to turn into another person, to try to reestablish a certainty about personal identity and character and self? It's a book about whether or not there is such a thing as the self,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not philosophical. It's a war story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And describing that moment, stepping in, in the doctor's office 2 years ago, after writing this book, how do you feel now?
Well, everything's still true. Everything I was contending with and that I wrote about out of the gate is still true. I was a little off about how self-annihilating the whole thing was likely to be. I was a little off in the timing. I thought I would never be able to do what you and I have just done now for an hour,
Yeah.
right? I thought my brain was so compromised. And they tell me that it will be in time. So it turns out that the great challenge that's come to me is to figure out what I do between the time when I find out this is what's happening and the time when it's basically happened.
Mm-hmm.
What life am I to live? This is a choice to be made. This is not a surrender question. It's like I'm called out by it, you could say. And so the book was, among other things, an attempt for me to track how to decide what constitutes the real thing now. What's the real thing, man? Is it the old grudges? Is it the old hurts? Is it the guy, the grief walker guy? Is that it? Is that all there is? I did that already. Do I have to keep doing it? Is it the guy that wrote all the books? Who did the Orphan Wisdom School? Is that the guy? How about Nights of Grief and Mystery, which we haven't even talked about, the whole sort of song and dance performance that we've done all over the world? Is that the guy? And I'm not saying any of these things are false people. I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply saying, do you know, if you used to dance, let's say, and something happens to your foot, and you simply can't dance as you once did, does that mean no dancing?
Mm-hmm.
Or does it mean your dancing now has to be as faithful to the times and the condition that you're in as it was when you were differently abled back in the day?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, Stephen, I want to be respectful of your time here. I really appreciate you sitting down and having this conversation today. Thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome. Thanks for asking, man.
Okay. Well, we'll say goodbye here then, I guess, Stephen.
All righty.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our donations page or subscribe and share with friends. The Canadians, working class roots, a free speech lens, Canadian contrarians.